Welcome, Lissa. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. And so, we're going to be talking today about acknowledging and healing personal trauma and potentially some side conversations around that topic. And so, I wondered if you could maybe start off before we dive in with just sharing a little bit about what is the kind of core focus or your mission in the world now? Because I know you've done a lot of different things with all the books you've written and the whole health medical institute that you've founded. And I really love your body of work, but I'm just keen for everyone to hear like where you're at right now in terms of your primary focuses and your work in the world.
Well, it's an interesting timing of the question, Bernadette, because I was in the middle of this COVIDian era in lockdown in Northern California, and really just taking advantage of that time to finish a book that I've been working on for 10 years called Sacred Medicine: A Doctor's Quest to Unravel the Mysteries of Healing. And so those 10 years took me all over the world studying with mystics and healers and shamans and indigenous healers and a variety of different types of healing practices as a sort of follow-up to my book Mind Over Medicine, which came out, which I wrote almost 10 years ago. I just rewrote the revised edition because there's also been so much that's changed in the science of how the body can heal itself. And what makes it difficult to heal itself. And so I was sort of nose down. It was a very interesting time to just be kind of, wow, we're in the middle of a pandemic. People need this content now more than ever. And like, it's not coming out until next year. And so I'm just gonna, sort of go nose down. And I wasn't really looking around. I was just trying to crystallize 10 years of what I've learned. And but the first half of the book is kind of all about the ways that, if we are deficient in energy, for example, if let's say we are low on life force, we're feeling depleted, we've lost our mojo, we're sick, we're anxious, we're depressed, we're tired, we're, not feeling good, having physical symptoms. What are the practices that could sort of almost like you would give blood if somebody was anemic? What are the ways that we can transfuse life force? Which is a whole body of practices that are like that. But then what I wasn't anticipating studying is the second half of the book wound up being about trauma healing. And that was an utter surprise to me, not at all what I was expecting when I went into this body of work. Because what I realized is that a lot of the people that identify as healers or energy healers or shamans or whatever, a lot of them are doing trauma work, but they're not trained as therapists. So some of them are doing it badly. And, sometimes causing more harm than good because they're not actually trained to facilitate trauma work. And so I didn't really know what to do with that. And I wound up studying very extensively and for many years with Richard Schwartz, the founder of Internal Family Systems, and Asha Clinton, the founder of Advanced Integrative Therapy, and Peter Levine, the founder of Somatic Experiencing, and really kind of going through this sort of 5-year sort of self-guided crash course in kind of getting a degree in therapy without getting a degree in therapy. Just doing training after training after training in becoming more trauma informed. And it fundamentally, I cannot tell you what a startling eye-opener it was. I knew about the impact, for example, of adverse childhood experiences on the physical body. I wrote about that in Mind Over Medicine. The data on that is very clear. Our California Surgeon General did an amazing TED Talk about adverse childhood experiences as it relates to pediatrics and adult onset disease as the result of childhood trauma. And so that, fortunately, is becoming more and more mainstream in the consciousness of conventional medicine, which is fantastic. But what was not on my radar at all was the impact of developmental trauma, which does not get picked up on an adverse childhood experience screen at all. This is things like if you were raised by a narcissistic parent, or if you had an overly controlling, or a person who didn't have good boundaries with you, a parent who didn't let you individuate, that either smothered you or neglected you. But your ACE score is 0. And these developmental traumas that can happen very early can impact our adult life in the most profound ways. And from my study, I realized they're incredibly linked with many of the diseases that conventional medicine just doesn't know how to treat. So that became a particular interest of mine. So I'm writing a book now with Asha Clinton called Trauma to Transformation about advanced integrative therapy, because there's no book about it. And one of the things I asked her to do is I said, Asha, we need an ACE score for developmental trauma. She's a trained psychotherapist, former professor from Princeton. So doctors need this. We need an ACE score for developmental trauma. So she's working on that. So we're making inroads, because again, it hasn't really been well studied either, because we don't have a score for it. But I think it's profound. And the number of people who have chronic post-traumatic stress disorder, CPTSD, as a result of developmental trauma and don't even know they have it, because unlike simple PTSD, where people might get sort of visual flashbacks from war trauma, for example, CPTSD, people get emotional flashbacks, and they suddenly just have an emotion. They don't know what triggered it, and it can be very confusing to their loved ones, because it might be something as simple as, oh, they just saw the color red and their mother was wearing the color red when she did this controlling behavior, and so they don't even identify it. It's so buried in the subconscious. So I think it's really exciting that we're starting to have more insight into this, because the good news is trauma can be treated.
Yeah.
But it's not a quick fix. And so that's why a lot of the energy healing practices, for example, that I put in part 1 of the book, what I considered sort of energy boosts or energy transfusions, I think those are really helpful, and they do make people feel better, but they're not always permanent, because it's almost like if somebody is bleeding and they go to the hospital and they're anemic, you give them a blood transfusion, you're going to make them feel better, but they're not going to stay better, because whatever is causing the bleeding is still going to drain their blood supply. So it would be malpractice not to find out, well, why are they bleeding? And then you go and treat whatever is making them bleed, and then they don't need the transfusions anymore. And I think healing is similar. I think we need to find out why we're hemorrhaging life force, which is usually the result of trauma. And we can use those energetic practices to fill our cup while we're doing really hard work, because it's really hard work, trauma healing. And that can sort of bolster us as a kind of self-care while we're plugging up the leaks and treating the reasons that our life force is draining. Yeah, I could say a lot more, but I'll pause.
This sounds like, and I've read some of your books, this sounds like this will be an epic book, but also like a game-changing book for wellness, because I've not seen anything like that. And I've been very interested to see what's come out of this deep down the rabbit hole journey you've been on. I've read you talking about going and studying so in depth, and that's what I appreciate about you, is you're not just rolling out the same thing you've learned and just repeating it. You're always on a quest to understand more. And I couldn't agree more that it's so important that so many people walking around with trauma that don't probably realize they have trauma and just think there's something wrong with them and don't understand why they can't, what so many people say, get it together. And it's like they would get it together if they could get it together. So clearly there's something else going on here.
Absolutely. And I'm one of those people. I didn't know how much trauma I was carrying in my system until my mother died 3 years ago. And it was like suddenly, because she was no longer in a body, I could work on my mommy trauma, which I was so loyal and attached to my mother that, symbiotically attached to my mother because of developmental trauma, that I couldn't see it. It's like you're swimming in a sea and you don't even know that there's an ocean around you. You don't know that there's anything other than the ocean. And so my therapist, who I'm currently working with, an internal family systems therapist, but she said, well, you wrote this book to save yourself. And I was like, oh man.
Oh,
and
wow.
I'm not sick, but I had lots of illnesses when I was working in the hospital. I was taking 7 medications, and So Mind Over Medicine began as the journey of how I got off all my medications and how all my illnesses went away. But this is like a whole other level. So I feel like the work I'm doing now is actually disease prevention, because I'm not sick. But I sincerely believe that the hardcore trauma healing work that I'm doing on myself could extend my life expectancy or extend my disease-free life. And I also have to say, I don't believe that anything is a panacea. That doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to live to be 100 and not have disabilities. Like anything could happen to me tomorrow. And I don't know why bad things happen to good people. And I don't try to explain that I do understand that, because I don't know how the mystery works. But it does seem to me that it's worth knowing what the tools in the world's medicine box are, including conventional medicine. I've never thrown conventional medicine under the bus, like, thank God for doctors and life-saving treatment when we have acute traumas like heart attacks and strokes and car accidents and broken bones and things like that, life-threatening illnesses. This is when I think conventional medicine does a good job. And I think it does a really bad job with many of those sort of mystery illnesses where they've ruled out everything. The blood tests are normal. People don't feel good and nothing is working, and they're trying different medications and things are only getting worse. And those are really the people that I wrote this book for. If conventional medicine can fix you with a pill, by all means, go take the pill.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
You know, if you have a urinary tract infection, it's your first urinary tract infection, like, it'll be gone in a week if you take Bactrim, you know?
Yeah. And I think it's being balanced, isn't it? Because, for example, I'm in the same camp as you in terms of really interested in the exploring the mystery of healing and using that to have healed a couple of different long-term conditions. But equally, my husband tore his retina and we went straight to A&E. And thankfully for New Zealand's amazing public health system, he had his eye lasered by a specialist at the hospital, which could have caused him significant eyesight issues. So we're not going to sit around applying energy healing to his torn retina. We're going straight to a medical specialist. Can I ask you before, this is actually probably a question that I thought I would ask at the end once we've been through some other questions, but do you believe that trauma will come up for healing in someone when it's right and safe for it to come up? Because when people are going through a process to heal themselves, whether they've got a physical challenge, whether they are just wanting to find greater peace, is it always that people should just go straight and start looking for trauma? Or do you believe that it comes in layers when it's maybe the right time or a safe time for them to be focusing on that? What's your sense of that?
Well, first of all, I'll say I don't know. I don't know why things happen the way they do. And if you had asked me that a year ago, I probably would have said, yes, that's exactly what I think. But I'm really getting, part of what I started to say in the beginning was that because my nose was down until September 1st, and then I suddenly looked up after finishing the manuscript, and I realized that there was a huge division happening in the New Age spiritual community that I had not been really paying attention to because I was so focused on this book. And that a lot of it is around the relationship to Black, Indigenous, people of color, and how New Age teachings and spiritual beliefs land on them. And so I've been doing all of my anti-racist work, like really hardcore lately, to try to catch up, because I feel a little behind the eight ball. I'm kind of one of those people, like you and I were talking about, who sort of identified my whole life as sort of a progressive, liberal supporter of marginalized people, sort of a protector of the people in my healing work. And, you know, my sister is biracial, and I watched how much racism she lived with growing up in the South. And so I kind of had this self-image of myself as sort of the good white person. And I just read Layla Said's Me and White Supremacy, and I was just like, oh my God, like, I get it. I get why so many spiritual BIPOC are angry at New Age teachers right now. So I'm now approaching that question that you just asked me through that lens. Yes. Where I guess I would have to say trauma comes when it comes. And if you're a BIPOC, then it comes all the time.
All the time.
It doesn't just come up when it feels like it because it's ready for healing. It comes up because of systemic racism.
Yeah, thank you for raising that, actually. And for anyone listening, that book, I'm assuming you would agree with me, Lissa, is a must read.
Oh, it is so clear and illuminating and difficult and beautiful. And I'm so grateful that a Black Muslim woman took the emotional labor to do this for people who would identify as kind of spiritual white women.
Mm.
And of course, it's not just for women, but she specifically wrote it for spiritual white women to say, if you really want to be an ally, here's what you need to see that you're not seeing because it's in a blind spot because of systemic racism, and you're not a bad person. And I'm not saying you're one of those white supremacists that is in Charlottesville, like openly KKK, but I'm saying you're complicit in upholding the systems of white supremacy through some of your spiritual beliefs and some of the ways that you talk and some of the ways that you relate. And it felt like this incredibly loving scalpel. And I am so motivated to really question everything that I say and teach and believe, including not reflexively answering a question like that in a way that might feel helpful and true to a white person who's on a healing journey, but might feel abusive and cruel to a Black person.
Yes. And I think you described it really well, a loving scalpel. And I think you're exactly right that it is a time we should always be questioning, challenging ourselves, being open. We won't move forward in any way, personally or collectively, until we're willing to put everything under the microscope, including our deeply held beliefs. And I think one of the things I was talking to someone about recently, I was talking to a conscious parenting expert who's an emotional intelligence expert, and we were talking about holding space and the ability that we need to develop, the emotional intelligence we need to develop to sit with someone's trauma and pain and hold space as a listening space without trying to tell them it's not right, without trying to fix it, without trying to deflect and move away. And it's difficult for many people to do, to sit and listen to someone's real lived experience and feel whatever you feel about that.
Right. And not silver lining it, right? Like not saying, oh, well, this trauma happened to you because now your soul is ready for this part of your development, which that belief has really helped me on my own journey when traumatic things have happened or traumatic memories have surfaced that I wasn't aware of. That was a very comforting belief system for me. But I also see that it's a belief system that might be helpful for people with white privilege, that it's a privilege to even have enough of a break from trauma, to have what feels like trauma-free times in my life.
Yes.
And then, oh, something traumatic happened. I haven't had a traumatic thing happen in 6 months. So my soul must be ready for the next growth phase, right? That's comforting to me. But I can see that even the ability to have trauma-free months is part of my privilege.
As a privilege. That's right.
That my sister doesn't get. She's like, sister, I don't get that. I get traumatized every day. Like just by being a biracial woman in a now Trump voting state, like that is traumatic every day. And I'm like, oh my God, I get it. And I feel ashamed for having parroted some of these beliefs because they do make me feel better, but they don't make her feel better.
Yeah. And I think the challenge is that some people might say, well, if it works for you, that's great. Yeah, if it works for you, that's great. But also if you're sharing it with other people, I have to, everyone has to take a moment to say, well, there may be people listening to this, the person I'm speaking to individually or within my family or within my professional network or publicly, that might not land well with. And in fact, it's not that we can say things all the time that everyone agrees with. It's not that. It's just having a compassionate, conscientious approach to know that actually it could be harmful or really hurtful. And I think that's what a lot of people are experiencing right now, is reflecting and saying, oh, actually, where I think I've been doing good, that actually could be doing harm.
That's the nuance, because again, it doesn't take away the value of that thought or belief, if it helps you personally, that's one thing. But when it becomes damaging is when I try to fix you or make you feel better or silver line you by saying, when something painful is coming up for you, oh, well, now your soul is ready to grow in that way. That's when I interfere with your experience, is when I'm potentially causing harm with the desire to help.
Yeah.
You know, and that's where I'm trying to be really careful. Like, that does actually help me when something traumatic happens in my life. And I went through 13 back-to-back traumas in the past 5 years, including losing my mother, which was a huge trauma. But some of them were the kinds of traumas I had never experienced in my relatively charmed and privileged life, where I felt terribly unfairly victimized by a system that oppressed me, that was not fair, and justice was not done. And I thought, wow, what makes me think that I am entitled to justice in a country that does not bring justice to half of its population?
Indeed, yeah.
Why would I feel like, well, I deserve justice when I was victimized? Why? So I felt really humbled by that. But it also was incredibly helpful to me to experience each of those traumas as a part of my soul's evolution. And looking back, I can say, wow, maybe that's what prepared me to do some of this anti-racism work, to really give me more empathy and more of a direct experience that I'll never be able to say I get it, because I'm not a person of color.
Yeah.
But I experienced some things that white privileged people usually don't. And it was awful. And all of a sudden, all of those belief systems that I had been parroting and even teaching in some of my books, I was like, oh my God, when my own students were like quoting them back to me, and I'm going, oh, seriously? That's the most unempathic thing anybody could possibly say to me right now. I'm hurt.
Wow,
I'm vulnerable.
Wake up call, right? That's a wake up call.
So embarrassing, and I felt so ashamed, right? But I'm also like, well, I taught them that. Like, they're
owning the moment, right?
They're quoting their teacher, and it felt awful.
And I think I heard you say something, either write something or say something recently about, don't wrong your shame. And I think, I don't know if I'm misquoting, please say so, but I heard or read something that effectively made me reflect upon the feeling of shame. So if you are looking at your view in the world, or your work in the world, or your whatever it is, whether it's working through, your position around social justice, racial justice, your white privilege, whatever it is, if you feel shame, you can sit in the fire with your shame and say, what do I do with this? Because this is a message to me and for me to activate or mobilize me in a certain way. And it's okay to feel that way, right? It's okay to have that feeling. It's like, what are you going to do with that? And what are you going to do about it? Don't turn away from it. Don't turn away from it.
Absolutely. And I'm a big fan of Carla McLaren's distinction around this. She wrote a great book called The Language of Emotions, and another book called The Art of Empathy. And she takes issue with, how shame has been so demonized in our culture. And I think a lot of it is because of Brene Brown's work, who's doing beautiful work. I love Brene Brown's work. And Brene makes the distinction that guilt says I did something bad, whereas shame says I am bad. And Carla disagrees. She says that guilt is not, it's a factual state. It's not an emotion. That guilt means you did the bad thing. Like, you're guilty, right? So you did the bad thing. It's a factual state, whereas shame is an actual emotion. And shame comes because it's trying to restore our integrity. It's the feeling, that rush. Like, I hate that feeling, but that rush that I get when I realize that I've taught my students something that might be hurtful to somebody who's in the middle of an acute trauma. And I get that rush of feeling like, I feel like I want a hole to just open up underneath me and let me drop through and sort of fall into the earth. And I'm feeling, that it's a very uncomfortable emotion. But the point of that emotion, I mean, Carla McLaren and Richard Schwartz of Internal Family Systems both teach that all emotions are here because they're trying to help us and they think they're protecting us. And none of them are worthy of being demonized, especially shame, because shame, you know, anger arises to help us protect our own boundaries. Like if our boundaries are getting violated, we are supposed to get angry. And shame, it arises to help us protect somebody else's boundary. It's the feeling that arises when we're doing something that might be hurting somebody else. And it's a good feeling because when we feel shame, then we feel motivated to change our behaviors and do better and stop hurting somebody. And shameless people are dangerous. I mean, we have a shameless person as the president of the United States right now. And it's evident how dangerous people who don't feel shame are. I mean, people who are blended with a sociopath part are shameless. They don't feel their shame. And it makes them capable of doing horrible, violent, traumatic things to other people because they don't feel shame. So shame is not a bad feeling. I mean, it is a bad feeling, but it's there because we should feel bad when we realize we've been complicit with participating in upholding white privilege or white supremacy or things like that, for example. We should feel that. That should feel bad. If anybody doesn't feel bad, if they're white and they read Layla Saeed's book, then there's something wrong with them, you know? But it doesn't mean we shouldn't fall down that hole and get paralyzed down there. We have to be loving and gentle with ourselves. And what Carla teaches is that when we allow the emotion to motivate the behavior that is being called forth, and she defines emotions as action requiring neurological programs. So it's a program in the brain that says, oh, shame is here. I need to make apologies and make amends and stop doing the harmful thing and make it right. And then the shame goes away naturally because you feel good. Like I feel good about the anti-racism work I'm doing in my community right now. That feels good. And I feel good being able to say, I'm sorry I hurt you at my workshop. I didn't mean to. I thought I was helping you, but I didn't realize that parroting some of these new age beliefs was causing unintentional harm. And I'm really grateful that I know now because I can feel ashamed. I can say, I'm sorry. I can create a way to have a dialogue about it. And then when you ask me a question like that, I can be like, oh, well, that's how I would have answered that before. But now I want to do better. And I want to make sure that any answer that I give you to a question is not only true for people with white privilege, but is also true for any marginalized person, whether that person is BIPOC or LGBTQIA+, or disabled or neurodiverse or in any other way, you know, different, such that not, you know, maybe not all spiritual teachings are equally helpful to all populations. And that's part of the nuance of what I'm really, really learning. It's not black and white. It's not like, well, this is a good teaching or it's a bad teaching. It's like, well, it's a helpful teaching in some settings for some people at some times. And part of my work in the world is to really discover all those tools and all those practices so that the patient or the client can self-identify which tool when, which belief when, and it's not somebody else imposing it on them, which can feel really shaming.
Yeah.
Like I remember when I was in France teaching my work about the 6 steps to healing yourself from Mind Over Medicine. I was teaching about 100 therapists at an energy psychology conference. And, you know, they're very much kind of my people, and they're mostly all white privileged people in the room. But one of them said to me, well, what do I do when, you know, the people in my life or when my clients, they're not interested in doing the 6 steps, which a lot of it is trauma healing, as a way to improve their chance of radical remission. I said, then you treat the part of you that thinks you have any business intruding in their healing journey. Yeah. Because it's none of your business. Like you can invite them, you can give them my book, you can tell them that it's an option, but it is totally up to them. If they're not interested in doing this work, get out of there, stop violating their boundary. And the look of shock on people's faces I was like, how many people do that? You push your spiritual beliefs or your thoughts about healing on a sick person when all they're really wanting is for you to just sit with them in their suffering and acknowledge how uncomfortable they are right now because they just got a cancer diagnosis, and you're giving them 100 books and telling them 100 things they should be doing, and they're just wanting to be loved because they're scared. So I think we have to be really careful. And here's the paradox. Yes, if people are interested, you can ask people, would you like some help about learning about possible tools that you could add to your toolbox beyond whatever your doctor is recommending? And if they say yes, and they have time and they're open and they're not overwhelmed, then absolutely you can give them Mind Over Medicine. Or Sacred Medicine once it's published. Like that's what these books are for. But it's certainly not to try to control or shame or manipulate or interfere with somebody else's healing journey, because my number one core teaching is everybody's entitled to their own journey.
Yeah, and I think it's adding on to that, when you love someone so much and you don't want to see them suffer, it takes a great deal of presence to not put your belief system upon them, thinking that you know better for what is right for them.
Oh, I'm so guilty of that. Again, I'm saying this, but like when my own mother got cancer, and I'm so attached to her and could not even imagine losing my mother, like I did not know how I would survive. That's how symbiotically attached we were at the hip and at the heart and at the brain, and like way too enmeshed. And I just couldn't imagine what it would be like to lose my mom. And I remember when I was younger, just feeling like I will not survive it. If my mother dies, I will die. And I really felt like that. I had parts inside of me, I'm using internal family systems language now, but I had parts inside of me that really believed that if she died, I would die, that we were so boundaryless and so not separate that her death would mean I couldn't survive. And so the impulse to want to impose my knowledge, my practices, my belief systems about healing, what I've learned on her, was so strong because of my own selfish desire to keep her for myself in a body on this planet. And it was incredibly hard work for me to realize that my mother has every right to navigate her cancer journey the way she wants. She's the boss. This is her body, her life, her potential death. And I had a hunch that my mother had never seen a therapist in her life. I had a hunch that she had a lot of unhealed burdens of trauma from her own history, and that treating those traumas might improve her chance of remission. But I also knew that, I could invite her, and I did. Mom, would you like me to help you find a therapist to work on any traumas that might make you more likely to be cured? And she said no. And that was the end of the story. Yeah. And then I had to go grieve. Yeah. That's my work. I have to grieve how much that scared me that moment when she made her free will choice. And I just want to say it to anybody who's listening, because if your audience is anything like my audience, I say we, and I don't want to speak for everybody, because I know you also have a lot of people from other countries, maybe people that are not white privileged and people that are not like me. So I don't want to assume everybody is like me. But I tend to work with, my number one clients are white female doctors. And white female therapists and white female health coaches and life coaches and energy healers and people like that. And so that particular population, we have a tendency to be very guilty of interfering with other people's boundaries in the name of, well, I'm just trying to help you. Yeah. So I just want to name that I realized that was part of my trauma. That was my boundary confusion of not even understanding where I was thinking that I was helping, but I was actually interfering and potentially harming people Also because I sort of identify as an empath. And so I would see things in people that were traumas. And I sort of thought it was my right or my privilege or my business to tell them what I saw so that they could go treat it, so that they could get better. And I learned the hard way and felt, again, shame. Oh, no, actually, that's penetrating their boundary and they have a right to have psychic privacy. And if I do see something, I should keep my mouth shut unless they are specifically asking me to tell them what I see. So that's been a difficult like
transition. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I'm going through this whole shattering of everything that I believed about myself as a healer, has all been put into question, especially in the past 6 months during this COVIDian era.
And Lissa, can I ask you, when we talk about the word trauma, for people that are listening that maybe are confused, do I have trauma? Is this thing that happened to me a trauma? Is that something I need to consider and help me with whether they're wanting to be more well, or they're suffering a significant health condition, or wanting more mental and emotional peace? Can you just talk a little bit about the traumas and the types of traumas? Because I read something where you're talking about small trauma, big trauma, trauma of everyday life. And I think most people hear the word trauma, certainly where I come from, in my country, where we hear the word trauma, that means a significant incident of abuse or a major, for example, accident or major infringement upon somebody's body or safety. But in fact, when we're talking about trauma healing and personal trauma and resolution of that for your wellness, it's not just those big T events, is it?
That's absolutely right. So what you're describing is what the medical community calls adverse childhood experiences, right? So that's those are the big T traumas. That's what, at least that's the language that I'm using when I say that. So that would be things like sexual abuse, childhood sexual abuse, any sexual abuse, rape, child abuse in general, parental abandonment, growing up in a war zone, having a parent with mental illness, or a parent who was in jail, or a parent who was an alcoholic, things like that. Mm-hmm. So those are obviously sort of big, having to go to war, things like that. Those are big T traumas. But I think the reason that so many people carry trauma burdens that they don't know about, in a way, the other kind of little T traumas, or what Buddhist psychiatrist Mark Epstein calls the traumas of everyday life. The problem with people who carry little T traumas is that they don't know they've been traumatized. People who have had those big T traumas usually know it, and it's obvious. Mm. But people with the little T traumas are like, why is my life so hard? Why do I keep repeating these painful events in my life? Why do I keep, dating the wrong guy? Why do I keep, picking a job where I recreate my, these painful feelings over and over? Like, why? And they don't understand. It doesn't make sense. So that's why I'll give you a couple of definitions of trauma. But before I do, I want to just clarify. We cannot live in a human body on planet Earth without experiencing trauma right now, period. So everybody is at minimum exposed to the collective trauma of environmental degradation, ecocide, systemic racism, colonization, like war. These things impact everybody, even if you're not someplace where there's a natural disaster. Like I'm in California in the wildfire zone, so I've had to evacuate multiple times in the past few years. That's traumatic. And, the people that are on the other side of the country are having to evacuate because of hurricanes. Like that's traumatic. And it's traumatic if you are, a Black, Indigenous person of color, especially in the United States, but many places in the world where colonization has created horrible traumas. Any place where the indigenous people have been colonized is horribly traumatized. And that impacts not just the people who have been harmed, but it impacts the perpetrators of that harm, because that is like serious soul loss, to be somebody who's capable of dehumanizing an entire population and committing genocide and land theft. And that is traumatic to be the perpetrator. So we poison our own souls if we behave that way. So I just wanted to put that as the landscape. If anybody thinks they're off the hook, you're not. And that can feel overwhelming sometimes. So just know that that's just universal right now, unless somebody somehow managed to be in an indigenous village that has not been touched by, the outside world, and their land has not been interrupted or burned down or stolen. Maybe there are a few pockets like that on the planet where people didn't grow up in the, in the sea of collective trauma. But most of us did, and that's real. But with that aside, I want to give a sort of more personal definition of a traumatizing event. The first one is from trauma researcher Dawson Church, who defines it as having to meet four criteria. Number one, the event is perceived as a threat to the person's physical survival. Number two, it overwhelms their coping capacity, producing a sense of powerlessness. Number three, it produces a feeling of isolation and aloneness. Number four, it violates their expectations. So when I read that definition, I was like, oh, wow, I had this flashback to being a little child. My brother is 2 years younger than me, but he was very small. He wasn't like a big threatening presence. And we were maybe 4 and 2. And I remember like wrestling with my brother and having my brother like clobber me and screaming for my mother to ask her to try to get me out of danger because my brother was clobbering me for apparently no good reason. I was sitting there just reading my book and he suddenly attacked me. And my mother, when she came in and saw us fighting, screamed at me and told me that I was going to get punished because I'm the older one, so I must have started it. Now that meets every criteria of I was perceiving a threat to my physical safety because my brother was beating the crap out of me. It was overwhelming my coping capacity and making me feel powerless because I was trying to get him to stop and I couldn't. And then I was asking my mother to help me get him to stop because that was part of my coping capacity, was to scream for help. And she wouldn't help stop it. And then I felt isolated and alone because she didn't believe me and was blaming me. And then that violated my expectations because I expected her to stand up for me and protect me from abuse. And how many of us have had something like that? But would that ever have registered as a trauma?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Right? And I mean, whatever, it's siblings tussling. But that was traumatic for me. And those traumas can actually create lifelong patterns. For me, for example, that particular trauma, I worked on it in my therapy, created a pattern of it's not worth screaming for help. Just tolerate the abuse. Don't stand up for yourself. Don't get angry. Don't fight back. And I used a whole slew of spiritual beliefs in my adult life of sort of spiritual bypassing because of that sort of anger phobia, conflict avoidance, inability to stand up for myself when I was being abused. And it put me in situations where I was in a domestic violence marriage and constantly practicing sort of spiritual bypassing and blind compassion and premature forgiveness and conflict avoidance and anger phobia and all of those sort of spiritual bypassing practices that we can use in the name of like, I'm such a good and spiritual person. But they go back to situations like that. So it can set us up for a life of pain, and we don't understand, why am I in so much pain?
Yeah.
So I want to read one more definition, if that's all right, and then we can unpack it if you want.
Right.
All right, I have to find it. So Asha Clinton, who's the founder of Advanced Integrative Therapy, defines trauma as any occurrence which, when we think back to it, and when it is triggered by some present event, evokes difficult emotions and or physical symptoms or sensations, giving rise to negative beliefs, desires, fantasies, compulsions, obsessions, addictions, or dissociation, blocks the development of positive qualities and spiritual connection, and fractures human wholeness.
What a amazing definition. And I think just hearing that, people will be going, oh yes,
right?
Oh yes, I have a plethora of such.
Right. So even negative beliefs, like, you know, in the new age, there's a lot of stuff around sort of finding your limiting beliefs and then doing affirmations. That doesn't work at all, ever. 0% of the time do affirmations work, because those beliefs got there because of trauma. And trauma causes us to develop beliefs. Like, for example, in the example that I gave with my brother, the belief is it's not worth fighting for yourself and standing up against abuse. It doesn't work. It's pointless to get angry. So then the impact of those beliefs goes on and on. So I could say to myself, you know, I'm deserving of love and respect a million times. And if I don't treat the trauma that caused those beliefs, the beliefs are still, the minute I stop saying the affirmation, I don't believe it anymore. I didn't actually change my belief at all, because the trauma and the beliefs that go with the trauma are still cycling in my system.
Yeah.
But I love, go ahead.
Yeah, in the body. So just thinking about
And
that,
the body.
and the link
Absolutely.
to work around mind over medicine, and the impact of our these experiences that we have that get stored in the body, the emotions that go with the event and the belief that came from the event and the emotion all connected together, we're then carrying those inside the body. And while I love affirmations and I make them and I share them with people, and they're a great boost for your daily mood, they do not create on their own lasting change, and they're not a tool or an appropriate strategy for creating the healing at the deeper level that's necessary for the belief, the emotional healing, and the trauma, for example.
Absolutely. And what happens though is that when we actually treat trauma, and I want to keep saying that, because people can start feeling sort of helpless or hopeless or powerless or overwhelmed. And I just want people to know trauma is treatable. Trauma is treatable. We didn't used to know how to treat it. People used to just go to talk therapy, and talking about your trauma can actually re-traumatize you and just further anchor the neurological pathways of the traumatic experience. But now we know so much more about trauma. We know that actually using these cutting edge trauma treatments, we can activate that neural pathway where the trauma lives in the brain and in the body. And we can give it a new experience and create the conditions for memory reconsolidation, where you literally rewire your neurology and change your body. And the beautiful thing about that is you don't need affirmations for that, because then when you treat the trauma, you naturally know that like for me, I naturally know that I deserve to stand up for myself if somebody is abusing me or gaslighting me now.
Yeah.
Right? Like, oh, duh. But I didn't need to say a single affirmation in order to get there. Once the trauma's treated, I know that I'm worthy. I know I'm worthy of fighting back. I know that my anger can help me. I know that shame isn't going to take me out. Like, I don't need to just sort of repeat empty platitudes that my hurt parts don't believe, because they're still hurt. Parts that haven't been treated yet are just not going to believe an affirmation. It may make me feel better. And I apologize if I'm in any way going against your belief system. I'm not trying to impose that or say that affirmations aren't helpful for some people. They can be, I would put them maybe in the category of that, like filling up your life force, like the transfusion.
Agree.
Right? So absolutely look in the mirror and tell yourself you're beautiful and you're lovable, and look into your own eyes and fall in love with yourself, and tell yourself everything that your parents didn't tell you when you were little, or everything that your partner isn't telling you that you need to hear. Like, you are the one you've been waiting for. And so that can be beautifully nourishing. So I don't want to interfere with that. I'm just saying it's not going to permanently change the belief unless you treat the part that took on that belief, usually really young.
Yeah.
And then that's really beautiful, because you get this reunion. And my favorite is internal family systems. And the treatment is basically reuniting your mature adult divine self, the God in you now, in your mature adult self. And that self becomes the caregiver of all of your hurt parts. And when you reunite the God in you with the part that's hurting, it is like I cry every time out of pure joy, because that part in me that's felt so isolated and alone and hurt and helpless and hopeless and worthless and disposable and all those awful feelings, when I come to retrieve it, it's kind of like a soul retrieval sort of process. Yeah. When I come back for it and I do the memory reconsolidation work with it, and I let that part tell me what should have happened, because I'm here now. We're going to make it right in the inner world. We're going to do what should have happened. And we're literally rewiring the neural pathways, and we're bringing that part out of the past and taking it someplace lovely and letting it unburden all of its harmful beliefs, all of its unhelpful behaviors, all of the painful emotions, and we're just letting it unburden all of those. And then we check on it every day. We go in and check on those parts for every day for at least 30 days until we know for sure they don't go back to the scene. And then it's almost like magic. You just stop having those thoughts.
Mm-hmm. So powerful. So in terms of healing modalities that you recommend, I know you have talked about internal family systems, and while I haven't experienced that myself, from what I've read about it, it sounds extremely powerful. And you also talked about advanced integrative therapy.
Uh-huh.
And so that's another modality that you would recommend for somebody if people are listening and they're like, I want to start down that journey of getting, trauma-informed therapy that's safe, and that you would recommend. IFS and AIT would be two that you would suggest people consider?
Yeah, I also really like Peter Levine's work with somatic experiencing. I have trained in all three, but I definitely have more experience in IFS and AIT because I have started teaching with the founders of both of those. Dick Schwartz and I taught about IFS as medical treatment, which he was kind of edgy for him because typically it's used to treat mental illness, but it's actually working to treat physical illness. They did one randomized controlled trial for people with rheumatoid arthritis that showed significant results with IFS treating rheumatoid arthritis symptoms. And I think it's actually very, very hopeful. They're trying to fundraise to get more money to do more studies to see what else can we prove that it works for medically. But I think it's definitely the cutting edge of medical treatment. And I've also been training doctors and other therapists with Asha Clinton in advanced integrative therapy, and Asha and I are writing a book about that. I know less about somatic experiencing, so I can't speak as much. And I know there are other really good treatments out there. So I could only, take on the depths of study that I needed for my discernment with so many different modalities. So I know there are others. Bessel van der Kolk has a great resource list in his book, The Body Keeps the Score.
Oh, yes.
That includes it includes internal family systems, and I forget what else is in there, but I would refer people to The Body Keeps the Score if you're really looking for some good trauma resources. And I just want to say also that part of my social justice activism is that I am really passionate about the unfairness in the world of healing, because the reality is that things like IFS and AIT, some therapists accept insurance, but a lot of them don't. They tend to be expensive. Doing what I'm doing, which is 90 minutes of therapy every week, is incredibly privileged to be able to afford that. And my social justice part really thinks that's unfair, and I'm really passionate about trying to bring these modalities to marginalized populations who really need them and may not be able to afford them. So I'm in the process of starting a nonprofit that is kind of the philanthropic arm of my work. I don't know if it'll stay this name, but it's the working title is Heal at Last, and we started just a placeholder site at healatlast.org. And our mission is to bring people in recovery from illness, injury, or trauma together in circles of healing. Originally, of course, we were planning on launching this March 2020. So in-person circles of healing suddenly was not possible. So we're now looking at possibly at least just starting the program on Zoom. But we're looking at bringing people who identify as in recovery from illness, injury, or trauma together in these circles of healing for the purposes of improving physical and mental health outcomes. Specifically for those people that, like, conventional medicine has not been able to help them. Again, if you can take a pill and you feel great and you're doing fine, like, you may not need this. But our goal is to be able to bring these cutting edge trauma healing methods like IFS and AIT and spiritual healing and energy medicine and movement and art and music, so that we can empower individuals and communities of healing who are ready for that deep dive. And not everybody is ready. But we want to make sure that those who are ready to treat any potential root causes of personal and collective trauma that may be impacting their physical or mental health, we want to make sure that anybody who's ready to do that has access to it. And we really believe that healing and transformation is everybody's birthright and should not be limited to people of privilege. And so, the whole point of this nonprofit is to find a way to bring deep healing work to anyone who is emotionally and spiritually ready for radical transformation, regardless of race, socioeconomic status, gender identity, political affiliation, religion, any of those kinds of things, because we need to democratize that. That's part of, I think, the social justice sort of rearranging that's happening in the past 6 months, really, where we're examining that. So I just wanted to name that because it's not ready yet, but it's on our radar, and people can get, if anybody's interested, because they're like, gosh, I want to do this healing work, but I can't afford a therapist. We can get on our mailing list at healatlast.org, and we can notify when we are doing that. And our model that we're basing it on is sort of the 12-step model. Like, look at 12-step. They took something that was once a luxury good, which was addiction recovery. And it used to be that you had to be rich and go to the Betty Ford Center and kind of do rehab, right? And now anybody can do 12-step. It's by donation only. It's led by people who have been through the program. They get peer-to-peer support for free from their sponsor. And when they get far enough along, they give peer-to-peer support as a sponsor, and they get community. And it's treating that sort of, one of my big passions is the public health epidemic of loneliness. And so that was the original sort of idea for this vision was, well, we need to treat the loneliness because it's a public health issue. And of course, here we are in social isolation, making it worse.
Right.
And so treating I was like, well, if we're going to treat the loneliness, we might as well do healing work while we're together and use the arts and use some of those energy medicine transfusion techniques to make it less painful while we do the core IFS work and AIT work. And so that's on my radar, but I think I might have a part that's just a bit grandiose, because it also seems an impossible vision to imagine that we could get this kind of work all over the world, in churches, in yoga studios, in community centers, in people's living rooms, by donation only, for anybody who is ready. But I guess we never do big visionary things if we can't in some way believe that we can do it. So I have two $100,000. Yeah, I have two $100,000 grants from people who believe I can do it.
Yes, I believe we can do it. I think impossible visions is exactly what we need. We don't need visions. That's realistic. That's realistic, and that's what we can achieve, because that doesn't take us anywhere. It doesn't take us beyond the bounds of the issues that people are facing. The only things that come around that create radical change are things that people say, oh, that can't be done. So yes, it can be done.
Yep.
And I support the impossible vision. I love it. Thank you. I'm going to make sure that there's a link with this video, because the video will be online, obviously, for some time. So hopefully once it's up and running, people can get access to that. I'm also going to make sure that some of the resources and things that you've spoken about during this session, I'll just put notes below the video. So if people are wondering about books you've mentioned or different modalities, they can go further and find out about those things. And I greatly appreciate your time and sharing what you've learned on your extensive journey. in discovering what makes people right for healing, what's, like this ongoing pathfinding that you do, where you are always looking for new ways to help people heal their bodies, heal their minds, heal their hearts. And I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. Well, I thank you. I really appreciate your validation of that. And I just want to tell your people, I'm not sure when this will go live, but part of what we're doing to get ready for the nonprofit is we're actually experimenting with a low priced Zoom option to test as our pilot. And we're doing it actually right now. We're calling it Alchemizing Uncertain Times Through Writing. We didn't intend for this to turn into the model itself, but we're realizing these 2-hour sessions we're doing right now, we're doing them once a week. And we're using IFS and writing and art and music and dancing and energy healing and community. And we're getting like 250 people together on Zoom to do this work together once or twice a week for anybody that's really in crisis. And so we're actively doing that also, just to put it on people's radar. We're hoping to sort of move it over into a regular thing. Right now, we're just kind of doing it 1 month at a time. So we just started this month, and people can come on this week, but then we'll be closing it until December, and then we'll do another month that starts in December. So
okay, well, we'll get this will definitely be out before the December one starts. So I just put a link to, should I put a link to lissarankin.com for people to be able to access information about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I can give you the specific link for that program as well.
Please. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you. And we're literally figuring this out together. It is a grand experiment. It's very exciting. It's very fun. It's also hard because, part of what we're doing, for example, is giving people writing prompts to write about a time when life was uncertain in childhood. And how did you cope? And then they're writing these beautiful stories. And we're creating this safe and brave holding space container where they get nothing but empathic listening and validation and approval and praise, and we just love bomb each other.
Like, so awesome.
In breakout groups, and people come back all shiny and like,
love it.
Yeah, because their tender parts are just getting loved. They're just getting loved. And to me, any spirituality that doesn't leave other people feeling loved, with empathy, with space holding, with care for our suffering, with generosity of our hearts and our spirits, is just needs to go on the trash heap. Like.
I hear you. It's just so important, and I love the space that you're holding for people, where you're generating that empathic listening and that, like you say, love bombing. And don't we all need it in this year? So if people are listening and that space sounds good to you, why wouldn't it? I'll make sure I have a specific link to that. I'll make sure that I've got that before, when this video goes out, Lissa. So,
and just so people know, we have it very inexpensively, but it's also available on a sliding scale. So we really don't want anybody who needs it to not be able to do it because of money.
I appreciate that a lot. So that's so awesome and inclusive. Thank you, Lissa.
Oh gosh, it's been a pleasure. This was fun. I'm so glad we got to do this.
Thank you so much.